Hi, everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our guest speaker tonight, who I imagine could not have had a prouder Jewish mother. I want to thank our synagogue staff, Rabbi Federgren, and program committee for organizing this event, our audience today for attending, and I would like to give a special thanks to Arnold and Anita Silber for sponsoring the entire lecture series. Rabbi Dr. Eddie Reichman is a professor of emergency medicine and professor of education and bioethics at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine of Yeshiva University. Rabbi Dr. Reichman completed his MD degree at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. While simultaneously completing his internal medicine residency and fellowship training, Rabbi Dr. Reichman received his rabbinic ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary of Yeshiva University. He writes and lectures widely in the field of Jewish medical ethics. He is a recipient of a Kornfeld Foundation Fellowship and the Rubenstein Prize in Medical Ethics, and is a member of both the board of the Halakhic Organ Donor Society and the advisory board of the Institute for Genetics and Public Policy. His research is devoted to the interface of medical history and Jewish law. If there are any questions during the lecture, please submit them to the chat and we will try to ask as many as we can at the very end. Dr. Rabbi Reichman, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mendelson. I really appreciate the introduction. Thank you so much, Rabbi Rosenblatt and Rabbi Federgren. It really is a pleasure, an honor, and a privilege to join you from Woodmere, New York, in Long Island. And the Rabbi and I were talking. We hope we've been trying to coordinate for quite some time to get together, and it is bittersweet that we finally get together on Zoom. But we look forward, God willing, to getting together in person. To share with you words of Torah, the relationship of Torah and science and medicine. Just to share with you what I've been up to over the last year. My clinical practice is emergency medicine. I practice at the Montefiore Medical Center, which is one of New York's larger medical centers. It's in the Bronx, New York. For those of you who are transplants from New York, you will remember the Bronx. We see, so I've seen quite a bit of COVID this year, many thousands of cases actually. Just to give you a brief update, we are not going to be talking a lot about the science of COVID. I suspect you've had a fair amount of overdose of the science of COVID, both from newspapers and Zoom sessions. I'll share with you in a moment what our perspective is going to be this evening, which I hope will be a perspective that you haven't had over the course of this time. But just to share with you the status quo, so things obviously started back around Purim time last year, not this past year, but over a year ago. Here, at least in New York, it was that was the worst of our situation. Things got better for a few months, and then unfortunately got significantly worse again for a second or a third wave. For the last few months, where I practice, I've been seeing COVID patients every single day. There hasn't been a single day where I haven't seen cases of COVID, but fortunately the percentages, at least where I'm practicing, are coming down. The New York State percentage of testing is around 3%. Where I practice, it's around 10% of those tested are COVID positive. But in addition to the numbers coming down, we obviously wish they'd been coming down a lot faster. Baruch Hashem, thank God, the patients are far less ill than they were initially, and nothing compares to those first few months in terms of the gravity and the magnitude, and thank God we're not seeing anything like that now. In addition to our beginning to roll out the vaccinations and some treatments that are useful. But what I wanted to share with you this evening, as I pull out my PowerPoint for today, is a perspective which I hope you haven't gotten too much of. And the title of our talk this evening is Precedented Times, and that's not a misprint. The rabbinic response to pandemics in the pre-modern, or if you will, the pre-moderna era. And I turn your attention to a New York Times article from a few months back, where the New York Times mentioned 20 phrases that defined 2020 And if you look on this this little graphic here, you can actually see all the phrases subsumed into the 2020 here. Hydroxychloroquine, PPE, Zoom, apropos our meeting this evening, flatten the curve, social distancing, bubble, frontline workers, and unprecedented. Unprecedented is the word that we're going to focus on this evening, a word that you've heard far too many times, more than you'd care to remember. But what we're going to talk about this evening is that while indeed there are many unprecedented aspects to this pandemic, and we will highlight a few of them, we are going to focus on the fact that many aspects are precedented, that there is in fact, in our history, over the past many hundreds of years, there have been similar experiences that communities, Jewish communities in different parts of the world have undergone, have experienced, and fortunately survived and thrived afterwards. And
it's okay. I got it.
And we hope to learn from those past experiences. So we begin with the COVID map of where we stand literally now. You look on the bottom of this map. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this. I use this quite frequently. This is from Johns Hopkins. This is the COVID-19 International Global Dashboard. This is from today, April 18th, 9:20 p.m. So for those of you in Vancouver, it's a futuristic map. And if you look, there are 141 million global cases of COVID-19, and tragically over 3 million deaths as of right now. That is a very tragic number. That is not an unprecedented number. There have been many pandemics in past history where many more people have died during the course of the pandemic. But I draw your attention to this number, which is the number of countries where COVID-19 is found. And that number is 192. Now you may ask me, and you may or may not know the answer, how many total countries are there in the world, of which 192 have COVID cases? So the answer is not too many more, depending on which number or which list you use, somewhere between 195 and 198 countries. So literally the entire globe is afflicted with this COVID pandemic simultaneously. That is something which is unprecedented. The rapidity and globality, if you will, of this pandemic is something which is truly unprecedented. Something also which is unprecedented from a positive perspective with respect to the Jewish community is the rabbinic response to the issues that we have been dealing with during this COVID pandemic. And just to contrast this, if you would have lived in the 1500s, 1600s during the course of some European pandemic, there were surely rabbis that were dealing with Jewish legal issues at that time. And people would have addressed the rabbis if they were able to contact them physically. There obviously was no phone communication or internet communication. You'd have to literally knock on the rabbi's door. The rabbi would render a decision either on the spot or after a period of time. And the only people that would know that decision would be the person who asked the question and his immediate family and circle of friends. You know, fast forward to today, where we now have rabbis responding to questions on a very rapid basis, complex questions across the globe, and those questions literally disseminated almost in real time to the entire Jewish community across the globe by virtue of many methods of communication. And here you have a few examples. You have Rabbi Usher Weiss, one of the great rabbinic authorities in Jerusalem, Rabbi Herschel Schechter, one of the prominent rabbinic authorities of Yeshiva University, Rabbi Dr. Avram Steinberg, and I'll actually just go off screen share for a second to show you. Just picked up this book. This is the I don't know if it's coming across as reverse or not, but it's the Corona.
It's coming across
coronavirus. Well. It's coming to normal. Okay, it's the coronavirus pandemic, historical, medical, and Halakhic perspectives by Rabbi Professor Avraham Steinberg and Dr. Ari Cement, which is both in English and on the other side actually is in Hebrew. So that's another one of the contributions. So we're seeing a tremendous proliferation of literature related to COVID-19. And what I'd like to do to set the stage for the rest of our discussion this evening is just to show you these two illustrations. So you have here on the left-hand side a physician in hazmat gear. Physician happens to be me. I may not be able to recognize me so well. Wearing my N95 mask underneath. This actually is, I don't wear this so much during COVID-19. This is a different iteration of the hazmat gear that I have. Compare and contrast to the illustration you see on the right-hand side of your screen, which is the classic plague physician, who is dressed not dissimilar to the way I am dressed. Long gown, gloves, shoes. I mean, actually, the booties could look not dissimilar to these shoes. The mask. This was, I guess, the European version of the N95. What they would have had back in those days, the reason they had the beak, for those of you who on Pesach, some of you may have used the bird's head Haggadah. This is not a manifestation of the bird's head approach to illustration, but rather in this beak were certain incense and spices, which allowed the physician to treat patients in areas where the smell was profoundly disturbing for the physician. So it really enabled the physician to carry on with their rounds in the midst of plague. So we're going to compare and contrast the past to the present. We'll actually start with the present, see what issues we are dealing with in the present, and then we'll turn our eyes backwards to the past and see many of the striking similarities between the past and the present. Just to give you a schematic of some of the plagues that we have experienced throughout the centuries, going back to the Antonine plague in the beginning of the first millennium, 165 to 180, the Black Death, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, the mid 1300s, the Great Plague of London, which we will have reference to in our discussion, the Italian plague, which before this evening you may have not been familiar with, but we'll see some really remarkable references from the Jewish community from this plague, and cholera pandemics, plural, 1 through 6, between 1817 and 1923. Cholera had 6 pandemics. Each one of those pandemics lasted more than 10 years, quite a long period of time. And yellow fever, Spanish flu, which is one, at least here in the United States, we reference frequently because that's the last one in our collective memories that was so severe as the current pandemic, and others which we neglect but are actually indeed pandemics. AIDS is a pandemic which is still continuing. And in the more recent decades, SARS, Ebola, MERS, and of course, the pandemic of du jour, which is COVID-19. Some of you may be familiar that SARS and MERS are actually of the coronavirus family, which is the same family as COVID-19. So let us go way back to March of 2020. Coronavirus declared a pandemic. The World Health Organization declares the coronavirus outbreak a pandemic. What's the difference between a pandemic and an epidemic? So pandemic spreads outside a local contiguous area to different regions. And of course, it not only became a pandemic, but became a global pandemic, afflicting almost all the countries in the entire world. Is there any precedent for such a concept in Jewish tradition? So indeed there is, and the precedent goes all the way back to the Talmud and the Tractate of Ta'anit, which deals with fasting and fast days. And the Mishnah cites, and there will be some Hebrew text, all that will be translated, so fear not. When the city is afflicted with plague, they sound a blast. The city fasts and they sound a blast. It's a debate whether they sound a blast of trumpets or whether the shofar would be sufficient. And they pray. And they pray that the plague should cease. what constitutes a plague? So the Mishnah is asking, much like in today, where there's a threshold for the definition of a pandemic, the Mishnah had a threshold for the definition of a rabbinic pandemic, which, if you reach the threshold, you would be required to fast and to blow the sound of the trumpet. What was that threshold? If in a city that can supply 500 foot soldiers, 3 deaths occurred on consecutive days from this particular medical condition, behold, this constitutes a plague. Less than this is not a plague. So you see, there is a precedent to the concept of the definition of the pandemic in rabbinic literature. Sheltering in place. I'm not sure if that was one of the 2020 expressions, but it's surely something which has entered our vocabulary, which hadn't been there previous to the onset of this pandemic. So that's something we are all familiar with. Is there such a concept in rabbinic literature? And here again, we turn to the Talmudic times. And the Talmud says, Dever bo'ir, if there is plague in the city, gather your feet, kanes raglecha. What does that mean? Limit the time you spend out of the house, meaning shelter in place. Is this something which was always practiced? Did people always remain in their homes during times of plague, or were people fleeing in times of plague? So today, in the 21st century, we have a lot of people that fled the urban areas for more rural areas. Here you have a few examples. COVID-19 is prompting wealthy people to move out of the cities. The high cost of panic moving. Are people really fleeing the cities because of COVID? Is there precedent for this in rabbinic literature? So here also you have precedent. And the precedent is in the rabbinic code of law, in the Shulchan Aruch, where Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, one of the great Ashkenazi rabbinic authorities, wrote, Od Kosvu sheyesh livroach min ha'ir keshedever ba'ir. They also wrote to flee from the city when a plague is in the city. You should flee from the city. And there's a debate how he could write this when the Talmud says you should stay in one place. And the general answer is that staying in one place, if you can flee before the plague really takes hold, then you should ideally flee. Once the plague has taken hold, then it's probably preferable to stay and not to flee, because it was perceived to have been a greater danger. And in fact, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, the author of this statement, practiced what he preached. And in this section on the bottom right hand of your slide is an introduction to a work he wrote for the holiday of Purim on Megillas Esther. It's called Mechir Yain. And there he records for us that he himself, from Moshe Isserles mi Krakow, from the city of Krakow in Poland, Hayisi Besoch HaGola, I was exiled from Krakow. Why? Machmas ipush ha'avir, because of the rotting or putrid air, which was the perception of contagion in that period of time, in the mid 1500s. Before that and after that as well, they thought that there was miasma. It was often called. They thought the air itself was causing the disease, which is not so far from the truth even today. Obviously, we know bacteria, viruses can be transmitted through the air. And he fled the city of Krakow, and he ended up in the city of Szydłów in Poland, which is where he wrote this particular work. We even have examples of rabbis fleeing. In the Great Plague of London in 1665, Chacham Jacob Sasportus, who was the head of the London Synagogue, he writes from abroad in July of 1666, these are the words of him who writes and signs here at Hamburg, and who fled from fear of the destroying hand of the Lord, which was against our community in London. And we have discussions about whether physicians could flee or should flee, or whether it's perhaps prohibited for physicians to flee. And in certain Jewish communities in Germany and in Poland, for example, a method frequently employed to hold physicians and attendants to their tasks during epidemics was to increase their pay, and to offer them bonuses. And there was a recent article in the New York Times about the cost of not fleeing for physicians, and the physicians that stay and take care of patients during pandemics. And the headline read, "They died saving others from COVID. Will anyone count them?" And it's really a call to remember those who have sacrificed their lives in order to care for those with COVID during this tragic time. And we have similar experiences in our history during the course of pandemics. And here's some examples of physicians who did not flee. So, for example, this is the epitaph of a young physician in Venice. His name is Yitzchak Gedalia. Lirfo Kihilos Kale Be'es Hadever Rofe Yitzchak Gedalia Ubala Kever. Tragically, he died. Is the recording of the events in the 1631 plague in Padua, and it talks about the tragic death of Kalman Colonimus Cantarini, who died also at a very young age as a physician treating patients in the Jewish ghetto of Padua in northern Italy. And what is this work where we find this reference to the death of Cantarini? The work is called Olam Hafuch, and this is the title page of this manuscript, only published really in the mid-20th century, remained in manuscript until then. Olam Hafuch means a world in upheaval, and it was authored by a physician named Avraham Catalano, to whom we will return a few times during the course of our session this evening. And Avraham Catalano took care of the Padua ghetto in 1631 from a religious perspective, from a medical perspective, from a social and a financial perspective. And he documented the entire episode, the entire event, which was roughly, it was a number of months it spanned. And he documented every single person who was involved and all those who tragically didn't survive as well. We have record also of physicians that fled. So Cantarini graduated from the University of Padua in 1623. One of his classmates was David Loria. David Loria graduated in August of that year, and Cantarini graduated in October of that year of 1623. This university, by the way, was famous for accepting Jews when almost no other university in the world was accepting Jews at this time. David Loria, unlike Cantarini, actually fled the ghetto of Padua, and he survived, went on to live a long life afterwards. Wearing a mask, returning back to the 21st century, something obviously that has become second nature to all of us, even though it's obviously frustrating and has been difficult to accommodate, but nonetheless, it's something we've all been acclimating to over this period of time. And here you have a wonderful idea of opening a little handheld device here to open your mask so you can eat while you're masked. Is there any precedent for masking? So as we saw at the very beginning, we have masking in this medieval illustration from 1656. And by the way, this picture, this very famous picture, illustration is from Rome in 1656. Keep that place and date in mind, because we will be talking about a Jewish source from that exact plague in that exact year. And this is the famous mask. But even later than that, we have reference to a mask in the Jewish legal literature from the 1800s, not from the 1900s, from the Chafetz Chaim, who wrote the Mishnah Berurah, famous book of Jewish law, on the Shulchan Aruch, on the code of Jewish law. And he writes in the laws of the fast of Tisha B'Av. And the laws of the fast of Tisha B'Av, he said, if you're in the midst of a pandemic, and in his days, we said there were cholera pandemics in the 1800s and early 1900s. He lived during a number of cholera pandemics. He said, if it's a cholera pandemic, you shouldn't leave the house. But if you do leave the house during the fast day, then yisa saviv l'chatmo upiv chaticha camphor. You should take a piece of camphor and put it around your mouth and nose. Umaat esev miyata. This is a misprint, actually. It's mint grass, should be mint grass. Camphor is something they used even back in the times of the Black Death to ward off plague. Isolation and quarantine. We sort of confuse these two terms. I'm going to lump them together. They actually are medically different. But the concept of isolating people or quarantining people in separate separate places is again something which, as physicians, for those of you who are in healthcare, we put people in isolation for a number of conditions. Tuberculosis was one we've done for years, and measles, and now for COVID-19. But for now, the entire world is familiar with quarantine and isolation. Do we have such precedent? Is that a precedented practice? So here we turn again to Olam Hafuch, this amazing work of Avram Catalano, and therein he writes, Emmanuel Bono fell ill, and buboes were seen near his ear. Buboes, you may recognize, is from bubonic plague. They were these masses which grew underneath the skin and of a purplish color. Then Elio Francisi attended to him, and Bono subsequently tragically died. And Catalanos tells us Francisi was then quarantined. Then the wife of Menachem Minkin died, and her threshold was quarantined. So quarantine was a very common practice for many centuries, and we see it reflected here in the Jewish community. Closing houses of worship. I had a few moments before our discussion. We were talking about where things are in Vancouver in terms of the situation in synagogues, and the rabbi was telling me that you are presently outside. Here in Woodmere, there are still some synagogues that have outdoor minyanim, but most of them have returned to inside, although they are socially distanced and masked. There's actually right now, as we are speaking, there is discussion because we are vaccinating as many people as possible. There's discussion whether there should be a so-called vaccine minyan of people who may be able to have a minyan together without masking and without socially distancing if they've been vaccinated. That's something that has not yet happened, but is at least on the table for discussion. Is there a precedent for such a thing as closure of the houses of worship in the past? Now, let me tell you what is unprecedented. What is unprecedented is the closure of such synagogues on a global basis simultaneously. That has never happened in the history of Judaism. But the concept of some synagogues closing in areas where there was plague, that has happened. And here you have an example of someone delivering a eulogy. He writes in his book, which was later published, Hesped Assisi, this Rabbi Katzenelbogen, who's the son of the Maharam of Padua, a very famous rabbi in Italy, and he writes that he delivered a eulogy from the courtyard of the ghetto, Bechatzer Haget. Why? Because the synagogues were closed, and this is in the 1500s because of plague. And in that particular plague, 50,000 people died in Venice, almost a third of the total population of Venice. When the synagogues were closed, rabbis were forced to deliver some sermons from the balcony. And here you see a Hasidic rabbi in Israel delivering a sermon, delivering a Jewish legal lecture from the balcony. Is that something which has precedent in Jewish history? And the answer is fascinatingly yes. And I'm going to take you off screen share here for a moment, just to show you. I happen to have a copy of this book. This book that I'm showing you, I'll show you some of the book inside, is called Otzar HaChaim. This is an original copy. This is from 1683 from Venice. This book has never been reprinted. It was written by Yaakov Zahalon. Yaakov Zahalon was both a rabbi and a physician in Rome at that time. And in his work, it's a medical work written in Hebrew for the Jewish community. He includes a number of passages about the plague which had transpired a number of years earlier. And he writes about the plague in Rome of 1656. Now, remember, I told you about that famous beaked physician of the plague is from Rome, 1656. That's exactly the time that Yaakov Zahalon is writing about. And he was a rabbi, keep in mind, in addition to being a physician for the plague. And he wrote, since the people were unable to come to the synagogue on Shabbat Parshat Toldot, which is November 18th, 1656, I, Yaakov Zahalon, delivered a sermon at the corner of Catalani Street from the window of the home of David Gottini, and the congregation stood in the street below to listen. On another occasion, I delivered a sermon on Tuscany Street, via Tuscany, from the window of the home of Yehuda Gottini. So there is precedent even to delivering sermons from the balcony in the past. Zahalon continues to describe things which we are also familiar with about what it was like to live in the ghetto during that time, in the pandemic, the epidemic of bubonic plague in Rome in 1656. And he writes, it was not permitted for anyone to leave their homes except to visit a physician. People were only allowed to leave for food at certain times. At night, no one was allowed out of their homes. If they were found on the streets, they would be placed in a prison within the ghetto. And finally, the punishment was very severe for the following. People could not congregate in groups. A gallows was built near the gate of the ghetto to punish those who violated this rule. And here you have an illustration of this exact scene. This is the entrance to the ghetto. These are the gallows. Now you may ask me, was the Jewish community responsible for building these gallows and possibly tragically hanging people on the gallows if they violated these dictates? The answer is no. That didn't stem from Jewish origin. That was the community. And Zahalon actually mentions the names of the physicians who took care of the Jewish community. And one of those physicians was Rofe Hanania Mimodigliano. And I just happened by divine coincidence this year to happen upon the medical diploma of this very physician. And he graduated at the University of Siena in Italy in 1628. And this is a copy of his diploma. He is identified as Hebrei, a Jew, which was not uncommon in those days for Italian universities for Jewish students to be identified as being Jewish. He tragically did not survive. He lost his life caring for Jewish patients in the ghetto of Rome during that period of time. Participation in a minyan, balcony minyanim. So this is something more in Israel here than in the United States or in Canada. But in Israel, when they close down the synagogues, there are these apartment buildings where the entire apartment buildings are filled with religious Jews. They wanted to continue davening together in a minyan. So they said, listen, we can't go to synagogue, but we all have balconies. Why don't we all come out of our balconies at the exact same time? And we can form a minyan and pray together and pray all the services that require a minyan. Like repeating the Shemona Esrei and Kedusha and saying Kaddish, which requires a minyan, etc. Is that halachically okay? Does Jewish law say it's okay to say Kaddish with a minyan of people, with 10 people that aren't on the same floor, aren't on the same level, but are in all different levels all across a 10-story apartment building? So that's something that's been in the pre-modern era. Chazulai, people who wish to join for a minyan together, 4 in one house and 6 in another. The 4, however, were in a lazaretto. What's a lazaretto? A lazaretto is an isolation house for people who either had the particular disease, which was bubonic plague at that time, or were exposed to the disease, but they couldn't leave. They were bound by law to stay in the house. But they could see the people in the other house where there were 6 people, and together with those 6 and these 4 in this house, they had, as they could see each other, they could participate in a minyan together. Synagogue and social distancing. Something also, unfortunately, which we're quite familiar with. This is the Western Wall, which is usually filled with thousands of people. This is a lone group of roughly 10 people in social distancing for the Western Wall. Is that something that we've seen in Jewish history? Here again, answer is yes, we have. and returning to Olam Hafuch of Abraham Catalano, he was about some info. Said we decreed the ghetto at that time in order to maintain distance, social distancing between the people during prayer. The unmarried men should occupy the courtyard of the Ashkenazi synagogue, and those who usually pray in the Italian synagogue should occupy the women's section. So for those of you who've been to the city of Padua, there are a number of synagogues still extant. The Ashkenazi synagogue is no longer a functioning synagogue, but it's actually been converted to the Jewish Museum of Padua. So the Jewish Museum of Padua. But that's what they did. They had some people up in the women's section, some people out in the courtyard, all for social distancing. They didn't have any 6 feet signs like we do today, but they understood the concept. There's another famous passage which has been quoted a lot by Rabbi Akiva Eiger during a famous rabbi in Poland during a cholera epidemic of 1830. And he wrote, in my view, and this was just for weekday prayer. We'll talk about the prayer during the high holidays in a moment. It is my view, it is true that gathering in about 15 people altogether, again, writing in 1830 during a cholera pandemic, the group should begin with first light, and then there should be another group, and each one should have a designated time to come and pray there. So they had a sign-up sheet for morning prayers, starting from the earliest time possible, continuing as long as possible from a Jewish legal perspective, and then you'd be able to have as many people pray as possible. And many people turn to this for guidance in the way they set up Minyan practice in the 21st century. Lottery was also used in the 21st century in order to pray at the Western Wall. The Western Wall had a lottery to decide which few people would be able to pray during the Shavuot service. Is that something for which there is precedent? And here we return to Rabbi Akiva Eiger and his rabbinic court in the city of Posen in Poland. During the high holidays, they had the dilemma: when the high holidays is packed, you can't have a packed synagogue during a cholera pandemic. It's not safe. So they decided only half the seats should be occupied. Now, they didn't have the 6-foot distancing, but they understood that there should be distance. And actually, for those of you who are following the current literature, there's a recent study about airplanes and the decrease of transmission of COVID-19. If you leave only one seat open between people, you decrease the transmission by some 57% or so. But only half the seats should be occupied, and a lottery to determine who should come for Rosh Hashanah and who should come for Yom Kippur. Military police should guard the entrances and check tickets. And he also said that it just goes to show you how things have changed in the course of time, that for Rosh Hashanah, davening should be limited to 5 hours. And no recitation of extra prayers, no additional aliyot to the Torah. The chazan shouldn't sing a lot. Some people would like this every Shabbos, but be that as it may. Today, just to give you an idea of how things have evolved, the services in Rosh Hashanah for this past Rosh Hashanah here in the New York area, at least, were limited to 2 hours, not to 5 hours. Visiting the sick is also something for which people are concerned about, and this is one of the many works today. It's Yad Yamim on Corona, but everybody pretty much agrees that when people are sick, you shouldn't go visit, even though there is a tremendous mitzvah to visit people who are sick. But if you could potentially contract an illness, you're prohibited from doing so. And is this something which has precedent? So here I bring a Bikur Choli manual, a manual for the Visiting the Sick Society of 1750 Berlin. And in that manual, they write, and in those days, it's not the case today, but if you were a member of this society, they took it very seriously. There were bylaws. You have to sign off on the bylaws. They had dinners every year and major fundraising, and taxed the community to provide support for these very important organizations. And in this, they write, Gam kibalnu aleinu levakir kol choli. We accept upon ourselves to visit everyone who's sick. Chutz except if they have certain illnesses which are contagious. And what illnesses do they specifically mention? I pulled out 2 illnesses here on the bottom. Pakin, which is smallpox, and mazaline, which is measles. So those are two illnesses back in 1750 Berlin, that if the patients were diagnosed with those illnesses, you would be absolved from visiting the sick. A loss of life tragically during this pandemic has been horrendous. Here you have a potter's field in the Bronx, where a mass grave where many people, unfortunately, whose identities are probably not even known, were buried during the early stages of the COVID pandemic. Unfortunately, we have precedent for this as well. This is the area of Venice, and we had mentioned the plague in Padua. Venice is about not too many far, maybe 40, 50 miles from Padua. This is a tombstone in the city of Venice, a cemetery which simply reads 1631 Ebrei. So it's a Jewish mass grave from the plague, the bubonic plague of 1631. And mourning practices have also changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is something, if we did our 2020 expressions in the Jewish community, Zoom Shiva would be one of those 20 expressions for 2020. And this is something that we've all become familiar with. What was the perception, or what was the practice of Shiva in the pre-modern age during the times of pandemics? And here you have a fascinating thing, which I think many people are probably unaware of, that the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, writes, Yesh Omrim B'Shas HaDever Ein Misablim. So we have a Zoom Shiva, which is a modified Shiva. People visit via computer communication. But in those days, some people held that there was no Shiva at all, zero. There would be no mourning practices. Why? Michum biasusa. So the Mechaber writes, the author of the Code of Jewish Law writes, because of fear. And there's a debate what that fear exactly means. Does it mean fear of contagion, which is our fear pretty much exclusively today, or does it mean psychological fear, that if there's so many people observing mourning practices, there was tremendous fear that people would be depressed, that the plague's advancing very significantly, and if that was the case, they would be less likely to effectively fight disease if they contracted the disease and suffered from this kind of depression. And just in the last few moments, we'll mention vaccine, and then we'll open up for questions. Now we're talking about vaccination, and the vaccines have started to roll out. Moderna and Pfizer were early at the gate, and then AstraZeneca has had some hiccups, and now Johnson & Johnson is having some hiccups. But Baruch Hashem, within a very short period of time, we had the production of vaccinations. Is that something for which there is precedent? So the very early stages of vaccination, there is fascinating Halakhic discussion, and we could actually spend an hour or two just on that Halakhic chapter, which is a fascinating chapter. But the very first disease for which vaccination was developed was smallpox. Here you have a potential treatment for smallpox. And just to give you an idea of how many people died of smallpox, by the way, according to statisticians, roughly 300 million people died of smallpox. 300 million over the span of roughly a century or so, maybe a little more. How many people today die of smallpox? 0. 0.0. And why not? The answer is one word: vaccination. That's the reason why we don't see any smallpox now. And just briefly, of course, because as you could well imagine, there is much to discuss here. Prior to the actual Jenner vaccination, what they used to do is it's really the same concept as vaccination. They would actually do what's called inoculation or variolation, where they would take the fluid from the smallpox of a sick child, in this portrait here, and they'd inject it into a healthy child over here, in the hopes that child would get a mild form of the disease, but not a severe form of the disease. And in fact, it worked most of the time. And the rabbis discussed this. Can you take a risk? Even though it worked most of the time, sometimes people died when they received this inoculation. So the rabbis wrote about this, and they wrote, for example, this is one of the more famous passages from the Tiferes Yisrael. Inoculation shall pakin, that he said it's permitted to perform this inoculation. Why? Even though 1 in 1,000 may die from the inoculation, if they contract the disease spontaneously, they're much more likely to die as a result. Now, keep in mind, they permitted this even though there's a high likelihood of death. So extrapolate to today, these vaccinations have almost no deaths associated with them. But COVID, contracting COVID has a fairly high percentage of deaths. So all the more so people would permit vaccines today. And there are even discussions today about whether one can vaccinate on Shabbos. Generally, you're only allowed to violate the Sabbath for a life-saving maneuver for someone who's actually sick. Can you violate Sabbath to receive a vaccine to prevent you from illness? And Rav Asher Weiss says that you can't necessarily violate any biblical laws, but you may be able to violate some rabbinic laws to protect yourself from this disease, especially if you won't be able to get the vaccine otherwise. Is there precedent for this discussion? So believe it or not, there's even precedent for this. There's discussion about inoculation on Shabbos. When they were doing inoculation back in the 1700s and 1800s, they would come to your town, you'd have one shot. And if you didn't get it then, you wouldn't get it at all. So they had the same exact kind of discussion then. And let me conclude with this slide, and then I'll open up for questions. The one thing which I think we have learned during the course of this year is humility. And I think this is reflected to some extent in this passage, which I read for you, which was written over 500 years ago, but is in many ways just as relevant then just as relevant today as it was then. And this was written by Rabbi Leo Davidas, who was a student of the Ari, these famous Kabbalistic figures. And he wrote, "Plagues are sent from God from time to time due to our sins. They result in widespread death of young and old, women and children for no discernible reason. These illnesses confuse and befuddle the physicians, and none amongst them can discern which treatment is good and which is bad. They offer a good prognosis for a patient, yet only 1 or 2 hours later, the patient tragically dies." And for those of us practicing and experiencing in this generation the COVID pandemic, especially for the first many months of the pandemic, this is exactly what we experienced. Nobody understood the disease, nobody knew where it was coming from. And despite the extraordinary advances that we have experienced in our lifetime in the world of medicine, a microscopic organism literally brought the entire globe to its knees. So it's a perhaps not so gentle reminder that for us to remember that it is indeed God who is the ultimate healer, and if we keep that in mind, hopefully we will survive this pandemic. And the one positive thing, which I will say explicitly, but hopefully is implicit in our discussion, we talked about pandemics, very tragic pandemics with significant loss of life for many, many hundreds of years. The Jewish community survived every one of these pandemics. They had the same experiences that we did. They all not only survived, they continued to thrive, they continued to grow to become the significant and extraordinary Jewish community that we have today. We are, God willing, towards the end of this pandemic, we will hopefully be able to view this in retrospect, and hopefully someday someone will have a discussion about our pandemic as being historical, and we'll learn the lessons for the future generations. All those who are in need of refuah, of healing, should have refuah shlema. And I'm happy to open up to any questions you have about the presentation specifically, or about the pandemic and the medicine of the pandemic, or vaccinations in general.
Rabbi Dr. Reichman, thank you very much for that very fascinating talk. We do have a number of questions from the group. So the first is, are there any writings within the Jewish community addressing and refuting anti-Semitic tropes accusing Jews of causing the plague?
Yes. And I'm not sure, I'm just going to check for a second. I'm going to try and find a slide for you while I'm speaking, and see if I can pull it up. But the concept of here, I'm gonna share. Where am I? I apologize, you bear with me for 1 second. The concept of anti-Semitism being associated with vaccination goes back to the original vaccine itself. So if you look at this illustration, this is the first anti-vaxxer illustration, or one of the first anti-vaxxer illustrations for Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccination. And it was written by James Gill. I mean, it was drawn by James Gilray. Now, for those of you who recall, the vaccination was derivative from cowpox. They would take the cowpox from the cow and they would inject it into the human being, and it would immunize them against smallpox because there's a cross-reactivity between cowpox and smallpox. What you see here is the anti-vaxxer campaign says that if you inject to turn into a cow. So you see this woman's head is becoming a cow. This cow is coming out of. What is this painting? I don't know if you can see it so clearly. I don't have my chat box on, and if we were live, I'd ask you to call out to see if you can guess what this is a picture of. But and I'm sure some of you are correctly guessing at home. But the answer is it is the golden calf. You're seeing the golden calf in this picture. And why are you seeing the golden calf in this picture? So one possible explanation is that it's vaccination is a false prophet. And that may be why you're seeing it. But there could be some anti-Semitic trope in this. And in fact, in this illustration, you have overt anti-Semitism associated with vaccination, with these classic tropes of the Jew sitting on the sow and the pig. This is a Judaicized Edward Jenner, and this is some kind of dealings, to get people to buy vaccines or to give vaccines to the Jewish community, so either the Jewish community could fill their coffers from the vaccination, or they could sterilize the entire world with vaccination. And in fact, the anti-Semitism associated with vaccination has been from the 1700s all the way through to today. There have been a number of organizations who have written. The British Kingdom has a full report on anti-Semitism associated with vaccination. The United States did a report. You may have seen some of these cartoons, virulently anti-Semitic cartoons. You might have seen people with the Jewish star. That says vaccinate, allusions there. So there is tremendous currents of anti-Semitism associated with vaccination. Fortunately, it's not so prominent, but it definitely exists and has existed for quite some time.
Thank you for that. Another question on the theme of vaccination. Is there any Jewish guidance about the concept of mandatory vaccination for achieving herd immunity?
Jewish, the situation where we find ourselves now in the Jewish world, we don't have a binding consensus opinion where rabbis, akin to the decision of one rabbinic figure. We don't have that kind of analogy. We don't have the Sanhedrin as the great legal court, Jewish court, which we had back in the times of the temple. But there are a number of rabbis who have discussed the issue of whether vaccines should be required. It is definitely part of the discussion. There are a number of rabbis who feel that vaccination can be coerced in certain circumstances if it is deemed medically to be beneficial to the larger community. Decisions for community are rendered in a different. Did I
We're just having some connection issues, I think.
Okay, sure, sorry.
One more question about vaccination. How does Jewish law understand who should get vaccinated first? How do we triage?
Yeah, great question. That is also something which is discussed extensively. So, for example, in this book by Rabbi Dr. Stein, there's sections on triaging. Generally, our triage protocols involve saving life, the people who are at the greatest risk of loss of life. Question is, how do you assess that? And there have been many discussions in the contemporary medical community, for example, that which may seem a little counterintuitive, but on the deeper analysis may be more effective. Is that when first vaccines came out, so the obvious knee-jerk response was vaccinate all the elderly population as fast as possible because they're the ones at greatest risk. But that may not, in the aggregate, cause the most effective use of vaccines. The people who are spreading the disease at the greatest pace, at the greatest speed, are the young and healthy. So if we vaccinate the young and healthy, these are the people who are vectors for disease to the elderly, then we may actually be minimizing disease more broadly. So for example, Rav Reichman, in his analysis, at least entertained that possibility that perhaps vaccinating the younger population, based on the contemporary discussions in the medical world, might be the way to go. But in the end, he actually decides that those who are at the greatest risk of loss of life should be vaccinated first. And of course, this is a simplification. There's much, you'd have to analyze each subgroup of population based on their prognosis. And the issue of triaging is an old issue in Jewish medical ethical literature in terms of who gets scarce resources. So that is a much broader discussion beyond vaccination.
Last question, is the 6 feet, or also known where we are as 2 meters, not from Halakha defining the distance a Kohen should keep from a dead body?
Yeah, interesting. That idea also entered my mind much later than it probably should have. But is it Dalet Amos? Is it the 4 Amos? So very, very interesting observation. Obviously, there's nothing in this world is coincidence. But whether God designed that to so that we should see some of the obvious associations, there could be some undertones there perhaps. But the 6 feet is by the way maybe shrinking now that we have vaccination. Some people are pushing for 3 feet, and these new studies from the airplanes show that perhaps less than 6 feet might be okay too. But it is a very intriguing idea.
Rabbi Dr. Reichman, thank you very much for this fascinating talk, and thank you very much for your services on the front line this past year, which I know has been quite difficult. I once again want to thank Arnold and Anita Silber for sponsoring the entire lecture series, and hopefully we can have you come in a more traditional in-person environment in the future.
It would be my pleasure. I'm also happy to share the PowerPoint. If anyone would like a copy of the PowerPoint, I'd be delighted to share that. I'll send it to the rabbis, and feel free to share with the congregation.
Thank you. One last thing. I just want to remind everyone that Mrs. Fettergren is giving her class right after Dr. Reichman's talk.
Remarkable talk, Rabbi. Thank you so much, Yasher Koach.
Thank you. Look forward to meeting you all in person one day soon.
Likewise.
Sounds good.